the man known to history as Emperor Tiberius Caesar Augustus, was born as Tiberius Claudius Nero on the 16th of November 42 BC in Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire. Tiberius is the shorthand of his name, which he would be known by throughout his life. His father was also named Tiberius Claudius Nero, a member of the patrician Roman upper class who hailed from a branch of the Claudian clan. He served as quaestor of Rome in 48 BC, a senior magistracy in which officials managed the Roman treasury. It is indicative of the family's political significance that he attained this office. His mother was Livia Drusilla, who came from a separate, more prominent branch of the Claudian clan than her husband. These Roman clans were not close-knit families, but were more like wider familial networks of cousins. It was not uncommon for intermarriage to occur within them. Livia was born on the 30th of January of either 59 BC or 58 BC, and was still a teenager by modern standards when she married Tiberius Claudius Nero in around 43 BC. This marriage produced two children, Tiberius, who was named after his father, and Drusus Claudius Nero, known as Nero Drusus, who was born on the 14th of January 38 BC. Tiberius's parents divorced late in 39 BC, when his mother was already pregnant with his brother. Divorce was very common in Roman society, as was remarriage, and it is unsurprising to find that Livia was quickly betrothed to Octavian, a member of the Julian clan. Livia married him just a few days following the birth of Drusus on the 17th of January 38 BC. Livia's new marriage brought her into the heart of Roman power politics in the second half of the 1st century BC. Over the previous century, the Roman Republic had experienced a very paradoxical set of events. On the one hand, the Republic had expanded at breathtaking speed, conquering huge swathes of territory across the eastern Mediterranean and north into Gaul, while also solidifying its control over regions such as the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa. But this rampant growth was matched by a speedy breakdown of the Republic's politics, as numerous Roman generals effectively became too powerful for the institutions of the Republic to control. Several civil wars had occurred as rival generals and politicians sought preeminence at Rome. The most recent of these had occurred between Pompeius Magnus and Julius Caesar. Caesar had emerged victorious in the first years before Tiberius's birth, but he was then assassinated by a cohort of Roman senators in 44 BC. Octavian, whom Livia married in 38 BC and who became Tiberius's stepfather, was Caesar's great-nephew and his adoptive heir. In the immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination, Octavian, along with one of Caesar's leading allies, Mark Antony, had effectively divided up control of the Republic between them, with Octavian dominant in the west and Antony in the east. Thus, though he cannot have been aware of it at the time, Tiberius had entered into one of the most powerful political families in the dying Roman Republic following his mother's second marriage. Like many others, Livia's husband Tiberius Claudius Nero was caught up in the civil war and initially sided with Caesar, but he later turned on Caesar just before his assassination. Following Caesar's death, he gave his support to Mark Antony and was rewarded by being appointed as praetor, another senior Roman public office, in 42 BC. He subsequently became involved in an attempted rising against Octavian in 41 BC. When this failed, Tiberius Claudius Nero fled to Sicily, which was under the control of Pompeius Magnus's son Sextus Pompeius at the time, with Livia and Tiberius in 40 BC before heading onwards to join Mark Antony in Greece. They returned to Italy the following year under the terms of an agreement known as the Misenum Pact, whereby Octavian, Antony, and Sextus agreed to end a naval blockade of Italy and pardon each other's supporters. There, Livia drifted away from her husband, who was more than twice her age, and towards Octavian. Following their divorce, Tiberius's father played no further role in Roman public life. There is some disagreement between historians over the earliest years of Tiberius and Nero Drusus as the stepsons of Octavian. Some suggest that the boys grew up within Octavian's household, with some contact with their father, whereas others suggest that both boys, or perhaps only Drusus, were placed in their biological father's care. Whatever the arrangement, when their father died sometime between late 33 BC and early 32 BC, he named Octavian in his will as guardian of his children. As the elder of his father's two children, Tiberius gave the oration at his father's funeral, despite being just 9 years old. Tiberius's education was typical for a patrician boy, his primary education taking place within the home rather than in a school, before going on to a Grammatiki school at 11 or 12 years. On the 24th of April 27 BC, at the age of 14, he assumed the toga virilis, taking the symbolic step into manhood and beginning his education in oratory as well as philosophy, law and history, an education which gave him a lifelong interest in literature. But even before assuming the toga virilis, Tiberius was already involved in public life. In 29 BC, he led a troop of boys during the Lusus Troiae, a Roman public holiday, and thereafter he began to play a part in many Roman public events. By this time, Tiberius was living within a family arrangement which was increasingly at the very heart of Roman politics. Following years of growing tensions between his stepfather Octavian and Mark Antony in the 30s BC, the pair went to war in 32 BC, with Octavian bringing the power of the western parts of the empire to bear against Antony in the east. The new civil war was a quick affair and was largely decided in a huge naval battle at Actium off the northwest coast of Greece in 31 BC. Thereafter, Antony killed himself and Octavian rose to become the undisputed power within the Roman Republic. To signify his new position, in 27 BC, he instituted a set of constitutional changes within the Republic. For instance, he would serve as the senior Roman magistrate, that of consul, for most of the next few years. He also appointed his senior-most allies, such as the general Marcus Agrippa, to other positions of power. Finally, he adopted the title of Princeps and took the name Imperator Caesar Augustus. Augustus means revered, and Caesar was adopted in honor of his great-uncle Julius Caesar. Princeps means first citizen, and was adopted by Augustus to signify that he was now the first citizen of the Roman Republic. But historians have come to see the title Imperator, which means commander, as the more significant. From it stems the word emperor, and it is that which Augustus would eventually become, Rome's first emperor, and the family which he had founded with Livia, the Julio-Claudians, named for their descent from the Julia and Claudian clans, became the first imperial dynasty of this new Roman Empire, which replaced the Roman Republic. In 26 BC, Tiberius joined his stepfather Caesar Augustus in a military campaign in Spain. Rome had controlled large parts of the peninsula since the 2nd century BC, but the northwestern region had stubbornly held out. One of the first acts of Augustus's reign was to pacify the last pockets of resistance in a conflict which became known as the Cantabrian Wars. In these, Tiberius held the rank of military tribune despite his young age, and in 25 BC, he collaborated with Octavian's nephew Marcellus to organize games for the soldiers in the camps. Tiberius and Marcellus returned to Rome shortly after this, at which point Marcellus married Augustus's daughter Julia, who was from an earlier marriage. Julia was the emperor's only biological child, and Marcellus's marriage to her seemed to indicate that he was now Augustus's designated successor, should the emperor die prematurely. Indeed, shortly after Augustus's return to Rome himself in 24 BC, Marcellus was granted the office of aedile. However, Tiberius was made a quaestor in a sign of his own significance within the imperial family as he entered his adult years. Nevertheless, it is clear that Augustus favored Marcellus as his heir at this time. In 23 BC, Augustus fell ill, and for a time, it was thought he wouldn't recover. It was expected that Marcellus would be named as his successor, but at that time, no one was officially designated. Augustus received treatment and recovered, but later the same year, Marcellus himself died, despite receiving treatment from the same physician. This death left Augustus's biological daughter Julia a widow, and Augustus's bloodline vulnerable to those with ambition. To this end, Marcus Agrippa, Augustus's famed general and close friend, was chosen as Julia's next husband. This had the double effect of counteracting any possible ambitions Agrippa might have to place his own children in the line of succession. Agrippa divorced Augustus's niece Marcella and married Julia in 21 BC. Their first two sons were born soon after, Gaius Caesar in 20 BC and Lucius Caesar in 17 BC. Thus, the marriage of Agrippa and Julia had formed a union between Augustus's only biological child and his closest ally. It now seemed that the succession would fall to one of their two eldest sons, Gaius and Lucius, in years to come. To that end, Augustus adopted the two boys, a formalistic act which declared to Roman society their position within the line of succession. With this done, it seemed that the possibility of Tiberius succeeding his stepfather one day diminished considerably. As well as holding several offices throughout the 20s BC, Tiberius involved himself in matters of law, mostly in the private sphere in cases dealing directly with Augustus. But in 22 BC, he was also involved in the successful prosecution of Fannius Caepio, a man accused of conspiring against the life of Augustus. 20 BC saw Tiberius lead a force to Armenia Major with the intention of installing Tigranes, son of King Artavasdes II, on the throne of this client kingdom of Rome's in the Caucasus in place of his brother Artaxerxes, who favored the Parthian Empire, Rome's perennial eastern enemy based out of Iran and Iraq. Tigranes had been a hostage in Rome for 10 years, and at the behest of Armenian representatives, Augustus sanctioned the mission. Armenia had been lost to the Romans in the previous decade through Mark Antony's dealings, and Augustus now had his chance to reclaim it. Artaxerxes was murdered before Tiberius's arrival, and so he won a bloodless victory and installed Tigranes on the throne, once again securing it as a client kingdom. The neighboring Parthian kingdom under Phraates IV gave no opposition and even returned the standards or banners of several Roman legions which the Parthians had defeated at the Battle of Carrhae 30 years earlier, something which Augustus had been pursuing through diplomatic means for a number of years. On his return to Rome, Tiberius was celebrated for these achievements, and shortly afterwards he married Vipsania Agrippina, Marcus Agrippa's daughter. In 16 BC, Tiberius took office as praetor of Rome, but much of his work as part of the wider imperial family over the next years would occur far away from the Eternal City itself, to the north in Germania. For much of its history, the Roman Republic had been exclusively a Mediterranean power, with little control over land any further north than Tuscany and Liguria in Italy. The general Marius had gradually begun extending Roman power northwards to the Alps in the late 2nd century BC, and Julius Caesar had overseen a series of formidable conquests in Gaul, the region approximating to modern-day France, in the 50s BC. Now, Augustus was determined not only to consolidate Caesar's earlier conquests by bringing wayward Celtic tribes in the Greater Gaul region under Rome's control, but also by pushing the borders of the empire north and east to defensive lines along the River Rhine and River Danube. In the north, this would involve conquering much of Germania, while in the south it would require control over regions which the Romans knew as Pannonia, Noricum and Illyricum, which approximate with the countries of Austria, Hungary, Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. When Augustus began this process in the mid-10s BC, he took Tiberius and his younger brother Drusus with him. It was an enterprise which Tiberius would engage with in one way or another for several decades. Much of the first year he spent dealing militarily with the incursions of the Germanic tribesmen across the Rhine, as well as engaging in diplomacy to quell the quarrels of the Gallic tribes. Following on from this, in 15 and 14 BC, Tiberius and Nero Drusus led forces within the Alpine regions of Raetia and Vindelicia, conquering the tribes and securing the region as part of Augustus's greater plan to extend the frontier to the Danube. It was while on campaign that Drusus's first son, whom he named Germanicus, was born. Back in Rome sometime later, Tiberius took office as consul on the 1st of January 13 BC. Around this time, his first child by Vipsania, Nero Claudius Drusus, known as Drusus the Younger to avoid confusing him with his uncle, was born. Tiberius seems to have been genuinely happy in his marriage to Vipsania, but things were soon to change when her father Marcus Agrippa died early in 12 BC. Once again, Julia, Augustus's only biological child, as the emperor and Livia never had children of their own, was widowed. So, on the instructions of Augustus, Tiberius was forced to divorce Vipsania, who was also pregnant with their second child, and to marry Julia. It is unknown what became of the second child of Vipsania, but in the same year, Julia gave birth to Agrippa's last child, Agrippa Postumus. The wedding between Julia and Tiberius was delayed whilst he was on campaign in Pannonia, and so was not formalized until 11 BC. Upon the conclusion of this Pannonian campaign, Tiberius was also voted to be allowed a celebratory triumph at Rome, but Augustus refused to allow him to celebrate it, a move which indicated that, while Tiberius might now be marrying his daughter, it was still the elder sons from Julia's marriage to Marcus Agrippa, Gaius and Lucius, who were considered his designated heirs, as these two were Augustus's biological grandsons. In 10 BC, the only child of Tiberius and Julia was born shortly after their wedding, but this child lived only a short time, a not uncommon occurrence given the rate of infant mortality at the time. For much of this period, Tiberius was otherwise once again on campaign, having accompanied Augustus to Gaul. He was subsequently sent on to Pannonia to repel an invasion there by the Dacians, a people from the Eastern Balkans, and put down another uprising of Dalmatians along the coast of the Western Balkans. It was in the late summer that Drusus the Elder's second son, a boy who was named Claudius, was born in Lugdunum, the Roman name for the city of Lyon in Gaul. This Claudius would one day, many decades later, become Emperor of Rome, despite suffering from a limp and partial deafness, disabilities which typically rendered an individual unfit to hold office in the eyes of the Romans. He would never know his father, as Tiberius's brother Drusus the Elder died after falling from his horse while campaigning in Germania the following year. He lingered for a time, which enabled Tiberius to quickly make the journey to Germania, and he was at his brother's side when he passed. Tiberius's display of mourning was moderate, as was in keeping with Roman traditions, but he did accompany his brother's body back to Rome on foot and gave a eulogy at the Roman Forum. Augustus gave a second eulogy in the Circus Flaminius to mark the death of his stepson. Tiberius now took his brother's place in Germania for the campaigning season of 8 BC, and despite lackluster results, caused in part by a lack of resources, he was awarded a triumph and appointed as consul for a second time in 7 BC. In 6 BC, Tiberius was granted tribunician powers for 5 years, raising his status to that which Marcus Agrippa had held previously, second only to Augustus himself. At the same time, though, Gaius, Julia's eldest son by Marcus Agrippa, was elected as consul despite only being 14 years of age, in a move which clearly indicated that Augustus still considered the boy his most obvious successor, as he was his eldest biological grandson. At this point in time, Tiberius's relationship with Julia was also souring, and she was perhaps in part responsible for the attempted premature advancement of her son. Fearing Tiberius and his own son from his marriage to Vipsania, Drusus the Younger would overshadow her children. The rupturing of relations led to Tiberius absenting himself from Rome for some time. He was supposed to return to Armenia to quell tensions in the wake of the death of King Tigranes II there, but he refused, instead asking to retire to the island of Rhodes off the coast of southern Turkey. After a 4-day hunger strike, an angry Augustus finally agreed to his request, and Tiberius left Rome later in 6 BC. Many arguments have been put forward to explain Tiberius's retirement, but his true motives remain unclear. What we do know is that this episode caused a rift between Tiberius and Augustus that would last for many years. Tiberius retained his tribunician power and lived quietly on Rhodes while Julia remained in Rome. In the meantime, both of her sons from her earlier marriage to Marcus Agrippa, Gaius and Lucius, received the title of Princeps Juventutis in 5 BC, further cementing their positions within the succession. Then, in 2 BC, Augustus ended the marriage between Tiberius and Julia. This was caused in part by the emperor's resentment of his daughter, following a series of affairs which she engaged in, including one with the younger son of his old rival Mark Antony. As a consequence, Augustus exiled his only biological child from Rome. Despite the tense relations between Julia and he, Tiberius wrote to Augustus to plead for clemency for his wife, perhaps in part because he knew that divorce would sever a link between himself and Augustus. These appeals fell on deaf ears. As a result, the following year, when Tiberius's tribunician powers expired, he asked for Augustus's permission to be allowed to return to Rome, now that Gaius and Lucius had seemingly been confirmed in their positions as Augustus's heirs. The emperor, surprisingly, refused to renew Tiberius's powers as tribune, and instead he was only confirmed as a legate, despite his mother Livia's interventions. Thus, Tiberius's position with Augustus seems to have been completely undermined by his spell in exile in Rhodes and the collapse of his marriage to Julia. Augustus's grandson and his most likely successor, Gaius, was sent to the east in 1 BC. He was 19 years old by this time and was granted proconsular imperium in the east, whereby the emperor effectively gave him significant military and political control over the provinces there. Augustus was evidently training him as his successor. Shortly after his arrival in the east, Tiberius left Rhodes to visit his stepson, but the reception he received was hostile. From here on, Tiberius's reputation steadily declined, and his political position was at a low ebb in the first years of the 1st century AD. He made repeated requests during this time to Augustus to be allowed to return to Rome, but these were consistently refused, with Augustus saying he would make no decision without the recommendation of Gaius. In 2 AD, one of the most significant figures in the line of succession died. This was Lucius, the second son of Julia and Marcus Agrippa. That year, Lucius had been appointed by Augustus to undertake a military command, suppressing a local revolt in Hispania. On his way to Iberia, he took ill in southern Gaul and died within days. He was just 18 years of age. This interruption to the succession was compounded 2 years later. Lucius's older brother, the heir to the empire to all intents and purposes, Gaius, had met with initial success in his mission to the east, campaigning against the Parthians, who abandoned their claims to Armenia. But Armenia itself was engaged in a civil war following the Roman appointment of their new king. It was during a siege of an Armenian town on the 9th of September 3 AD that Gaius was badly injured. The injury caused him to fall into despondency, and he requested retirement from public life. Augustus convinced him to return to Rome, although Gaius was still intent on retiring. But on the 21st of February 4 AD, he died in the port town of Limyra. Now, both Gaius and Lucius, the two biological grandsons of Augustus, whom he had been cultivating as his potential successors for the last decade, had both died within less than 2 years of each other, throwing the succession into disarray at a time when Augustus was in his mid-60s, a ripe old age by the standards of the time. Augustus was now once again left without a clear plan of succession. His aspirations to preserve his direct bloodline could still be attained through the deceased Drusus the eldest son Germanicus. This nephew of Tiberius was due to be married to Agrippina, the daughter of Julia and Marcus Agrippa. As such, any children of Germanicus and Agrippina's marriage would be Augustus's biological great-grandchildren. Nevertheless, Germanicus was deemed too young and inexperienced to rule at that time, and so once again, Augustus turned to Tiberius. Despite his own reservations, Tiberius accepted a restoration of his tribunician powers, which his stepfather offered shortly after Gaius's death in 4 AD. as well as a senior military command in Germania. Augustus then instructed Tiberius to adopt his nephew Germanicus, following which Augustus reciprocated by adopting Tiberius over 40 years after first becoming his stepfather. Consequently, it seemed to be clear that the new line of succession was that Tiberius would succeed Augustus, and Germanicus would be groomed to succeed Tiberius in turn down the line. Tiberius was not popular with the general populace at Rome, but when he returned to Germania, he was received warmly by the soldiers that had previously served under him years earlier. The German campaigns during 4 AD and 5 AD were massively successful. Indeed, so successful were they that a new plan to extend the Roman border beyond the River Rhine to the more eastwardly River Elbe was now being adopted. In 6 AD, after wintering in Rome, Tiberius prepared to attack the Marcomanni in the region around Austria and Czechia today, but revolts to the south in Dalmatia and Pannonia put an end to this ambition. Tiberius quickly concluded a treaty with the Marcomanni and turned back to deal with the uprisings, taking up a position at Siscia to stop any rebel attempts to enter Italy and await reinforcements. In 7 AD, he was joined by Germanicus and moved slowly east and south in a series of small skirmishes rather than engaging the main forces of rebels. Although many wished for a quick end to the uprisings, including Augustus, Tiberius continued with his tactics, engaging in a scorched earth policy. The revolt in Pannonia ended in capitulation in 8 AD, in part due to Tiberius's tactics, which had resulted in famine and disease ravaging the region. In 9 AD, Tiberius moved against Dalmatia, eventually capturing the leader of the uprising Bato and stamping out the last remnants of rebellion. Having ended the Pannonian Wars, Tiberius was granted a triumph at Rome. But on his return to the city, he delayed the celebration when news of the massacre of 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest in central Germania by a massive alliance of Germanic tribesmen reached the city. It had transpired that the project to extend the northern border to the River Elbe had been too ambitious, and the Romans now pulled back to the River Rhine. Tiberius left to oversee these maneuvers. He took command of the armies on the Rhine and implemented the same slow and steady advance as in Pannonia, again adopting a scorched earth approach to secure the northern border along the course of the Rhine. The campaign continued over the next 2 years, and in 12 AD, when Germanicus took his first consulship, Tiberius returned to Rome, celebrating the delayed Pannonian triumph on the 23rd of October that year. Tiberius's influence increased greatly following his return from retirement, and many of his friends and those serving under him saw advancement within public life. His sons also advanced through the ranks. By way of contrast, Tiberius stunted the career advancement of one of his rivals for power, Agrippa Postumus, the third and now only living son of Julia and Marcus Agrippa, who had been born after Agrippa died. His taking of the toga virilis was delayed until 5 AD, and no privileges were granted to him. Then, at some point in 6 AD, Augustus made the decision to renounce Agrippa Postumus's position as one of his heirs, due to what he called Postumus's beastly nature, effectively terminating his adoption and his place in the succession, and sent him away to Sarentum, before imposing a permanent exile on the island of Planasia, off the coast of Tuscany in 7 AD, when his behavior failed to improve. As a result, by the last years of Augustus's reign, there was no doubt that Tiberius would succeed his stepfather as princeps and imperator of Rome. Accordingly, in the last years of the reign, his tribunician powers were renewed, and at Augustus's request, a law was passed that made Tiberius's imperium equal with his own. Then in 14 AD, after conducting a census together, Tiberius set out for Illyricum, accompanied by Augustus for a short distance before the two men separated. Just a few days later, Tiberius was recalled as Augustus lay on his deathbed in the town of Nola in southern Italy. It is unclear whether Tiberius arrived there before Augustus died on the 19th of August, 14 AD. Augustus seems to have engineered one final political deed. Agrippa Posthumus would not survive him. It seems he had left some form of standing order for Agrippa's execution upon his own death, and when word reached Planasia that Augustus had died, the orders were carried out by the Praetorian centurion guarding him. While the exact motives for the execution remain unclear, it is likely that Augustus sought to secure the succession by removing his unstable grandson, even though Agrippa could not be considered a serious contender by this time. Tiberius denied any knowledge of the deed when it was reported to him, and pronounced he would bring those responsible before the Senate, but this never happened, and Tiberius later stated that Augustus had indeed left the order for the execution. Later the following year, Julia also died. Tiberius removed the small freedoms she had been granted by Augustus in exile following her move to Rhegium, but there is some question over whether her death was natural or caused by imposed starvation. Tiberius accompanied Augustus's body back to Rome, and in the opening meeting of the Senate, where the will was to be read, he was said to be so overcome with emotion that the speech had to be read for him. The funeral and cremation followed, in which Tiberius played his part, and once Augustus's ashes had been interred in his mausoleum, the Senate met again on the 17th of September and deified Augustus. Discussion then turned to the succession, and a motion was put forward by the Senate to determine Tiberius's position. In no way is it suggested that they intended to strip power away from the role that Augustus had created. Rather, it was to confirm Tiberius in his position. Some historians have suggested it was at this point that we see Tiberius's hesitation at stepping into the role of emperor. But others assert that it was not so much hesitation on Tiberius's part, as he could have vetoed the motion, but did not. Rather, he professed that the duty of governing the empire should not fall on the shoulders of just one man. But this was probably something of a ploy to ensure he was appointed to the role of princeps. Perhaps some of this hesitation was genuine. After all, Tiberius was already in his 50s by 14 AD, and to rule the newly formed empire would be burdensome. But ultimately, his desire for power won out, and after much back and forth and some sharp words from both sides, Tiberius was acclaimed as Augustus's successor. Through his actions, Tiberius had likely sought to emulate Augustus, who had laid down his powers in front of the Senate years before. But in his case, they saw only obstructiveness. Already so early in his rule, Tiberius had caused bad feeling within the Senate, which was to linger. At the same meeting, many honors were conferred on his mother Livia, which went against Tiberius's traditionalist values with regards to women's influence within the political sphere. And at his own request, Germanicus, who was effectively the new heir, was granted the proconsular imperium. Following the death of Augustus, and before Tiberius's rule was secure, trouble broke out within the legions in Pannonia, and then those stationed further north along the river Rhine. To deal with these, Tiberius dispatched his own biological son from his earlier marriage to Vipsania, Drusus the Younger, to Pannonia. He was accompanied by an individual who would play a major role in Tiberius's reign. This was Sejanus, the newly appointed prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the imperial bodyguard, which were the only troops allowed to be stationed at Rome and in central Italy. The legions which had revolted, and which Drusus the Younger and Sejanus had been appointed to suppress the insurrection of, weren't necessarily opposed to Tiberius's succession, but they did believe that with the death of Augustus, the time was right for them to demand redress of the wrongs which they believed had been perpetrated against them in recent times, namely, poor conditions in their barracks and inadequate pay and remuneration. When Drusus the Younger arrived in camp in the north, he read a letter from Tiberius, who expressed concern for the treatment of his soldiers and claimed that he would bring their demands to the Roman Senate once he had finished grieving his stepfather. Drusus the Younger would make some concessions in the meantime. That same night, if we are to believe the Roman historians who related the event, there was a lunar eclipse which terrified the soldiers into thinking their actions in revolting had earned them the ire of the gods. Drusus the Younger was quick to exploit this feeling, and the mutineers calmed. The next day, 2 leading figures in the mutiny were rounded up and executed, while others were dealt with by the soldiers themselves to prove their loyalty. A heavy downpour which kept the men confined to their barracks was again interpreted as a sign of dissatisfaction, and eventually the 3 legions dispersed to their winter quarters without further quarrel. Initially, the mutineers on the Rhine made the same demands as those in Pannonia: better treatment at the hands of their superiors and higher pay, as well as demobilization after their period of service and proper grants of land to retired soldiers. Some of these believed that they could install Germanicus, who had become very popular both among the citizens of Rome and within the Roman legions, as the emperor, but he remained loyal to Tiberius. When the mutiny began, Germanicus was in Gaul, but rushed back when he heard the news. He was unable to offer concessions, but exposing a weakness in his character, it is said he forged a letter from Tiberius acceding to some of the demands, but the soldiers weren't fooled. To that end, Germanicus sent his tribunes to the task of demobilization and was eventually forced to use his own coin to meet the demand for higher wages. But when envoys later arrived from Rome, further violence followed. The mutiny was only ended when Germanicus had his pregnant wife Agrippina sent out to carry their infant son to the safety of a neighboring tribe from the camp. This act shamed the legions, and they professed their loyalty, crying out for the guilty to be punished. Germanicus handed over the duty of punishing the ringleaders to the soldiers so as to keep the affection of his men. Tiberius was criticized for not taking a more direct hand in dealing personally with the mutinies which followed his accession, but defended himself by saying that had he visited either army first, the other would have taken offense, thus worsening the situation. His biological son Drusus the Younger and his adoptive son Germanicus were to act, and he would back them from a distance. This criticism early in his reign foreshadowed later issues, much of it related to his public image. Tiberius was an eloquent speaker when he spoke sincerely, but was known to struggle over words when he spoke in half-truths. When news that the mutinies had been dealt with reached Rome, he spoke in the Senate of Drusus the Younger, for whom his praise was sincere, but gave a less than convincing performance when his words turned to Germanicus, despite extolling his courage. Tiberius was suspicious of his conduct in halting the mutiny, and would later rescind the single granted concession which Germanicus had made to the legionaries, specifically a promise to reduce the number of years of service required by the Roman soldiers. Tiberius had been princeps for almost 6 months when he was granted the title Pontifex Maximus on the 10th of March 15 AD. This was the most senior religious office in the Roman state. However, he refused to name himself as imperator and rejected the title of Pater Patriae, Father of the Nation, as well as refusing the name Augustus. Despite the latter refusal, he would still be known as Tiberius Caesar Augustus throughout his reign, as coins and inscriptions on many monuments in Rome and elsewhere attest. In refusing these honors and titles, Tiberius provided a public demonstration of his adherence to moderation and his feeling on the role the Senate should play in governing the Roman state. Despite the hypocrisy Tiberius presented early on in the Senate, he was not as hostile towards the old institutions of the Republic as some of his successors would be. For instance, in accordance with the wishes of Augustus and in keeping with his own beliefs on their role, soon after his accession, he granted the right to elect magistrates to the Senate. Moreover, in the early years of his rule, Tiberius would often sit in silence during debates held in the Senate, allowing both sides to make their case in an attempt not to influence rulings, believing firmly that the Senate had the right to make their own free decisions. Under Augustus, the Senate had been servile rather than free to exercise their own will, and, in many cases, despite the lack of interjection from Tiberius, they often reverted to this attitude in deference to the princeps and the influence of other members of the imperial family. So ingrained was this attitude that, at times, Tiberius would become irritated when senators passed matters to him which he felt they could deal with themselves. But despite his neutrality, Tiberius would intervene on occasion, either in refusing to allow the Senate to pass off matters to him or, after lengthy debates, would interject late in proceedings to announce the outcome he desired. Over time, this practice would inadvertently see the relationship between Tiberius and the Senate deteriorate further. During these early years, he turned a blind eye to the enmity of others, even when directed at himself, still holding with his belief of the right to free speech. But he detested sycophants, and in this way cultivated his virtues and reputation. Although he cared nothing for the affection of the people towards him, he wanted only their respect. Tiberius made some adjustments to matters pertaining to gladiatorial and theatrical entertainment at Rome early on, as these were activities that he didn't enjoy, limiting the number of gladiatorial games that could take place. He rejected the motion that actors could be flogged following riots at a performance in 15 AD, thereby upholding Augustus's ruling that they were immune from such punishments. However, he did introduce restrictions to actors' pay and controlled who they could keep company with. Later, in 23 AD, actors would be banished from Rome, not to return during his rule. These interventions in the public entertainments at Rome were not popular amongst the city's wider population. However, he attempted to counterbalance this repressive attitude with welfare measures. For instance, when the river Tiber flooded in 15 AD and his people's welfare was at stake, Tiberius created a new board of curators to deal with the problem. But their suggestions to remedy the situation met with hostility in the affected towns and parts of the city itself, and so the Senate voted against the proposals. Later in 17 AD, Tiberius would once again demonstrate his generosity when he provided lavish grants to towns in Asia devastated by an earthquake, and in 22 AD would fix prices of corn to keep them affordable for the public, while making up the difference to the dealers during a time of food scarcity. Throughout the early years of his reign, Tiberius took an active interest in the law and attended the courts, taking a place to the side of the sitting praetor so they didn't have to give up their official seat. Tiberius intervened when he felt it necessary in the face of corruption and bribery and the undue influence that some exerted on their cases given their high standing. But under his rule there was a marked expansion of the law of maestas. This lessened the status of the Roman people, making treason sacrilegious due to the supposed divinity of the emperor. The treason law had been in use since late Republican times, but had undergone several changes, including under Augustus. The newly strengthened law under Tiberius was readily exploited by informers who accused individuals of disrespecting the position of emperor and the imperial family, as rewards were granted for successful prosecutions under the law of maestas, and many cases were brought before the Senate on such charges, coupled with other crimes such as adultery or extortion. Tiberius would often intervene, quashing trials he believed trivial and proposing milder sentences on those that were found guilty, depending on the crime and their status. While Tiberius remained in Rome, the campaign in Germania continued in 15 AD, with Germanicus overseeing affairs. The goal here was to secure the border along the Rhine more firmly, as Augustus had left orders on his death that his successors should seek to consolidate the empire and protect its borders rather than expand it any further. Tiberius's earlier successful and cautious tactics were abandoned by Germanicus. His aim was to split the main tribes of central Germania, such as the Cherusci and Chatti, from one another. Germanicus moved first against the Chatti, with the legions of the Upper Rhine, routing them from their lands, and when he refused to grant a peace, the tribes split, with some joining him, while others melted away into the forests of the parts of Germania beyond the Roman border. In the months that followed, further campaigning occurred as Arminius, the German warlord who had orchestrated the defeat of 3 Roman legions at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest back in 9 AD, materialized as the primary antagonist to Germanicus. Arminius roused both his own followers and the neighboring tribes against the Romans. In response, Germanicus dispatched 3 separate Roman forces eastwards beyond the river Rhine. The goal here was to semi-pacify this region beyond Rome's borders, which, if left under the control of warlords like Arminius, would always pose a serious threat to the Roman forts along the Rhine and the Roman colonies beyond. When this Roman force came upon the site of the massacre of the Teutoburg forest nearly a decade earlier, they raised a burial mound to honor the dead. Further into this vast primeval forest, which is all but gone today, but which covered a large proportion of Germany in ancient times, Germanicus's forces faced those of Arminius. But the sides never engaged, as the campaigning season was almost over and neither was entirely confident of winning the day. Consequently, the Romans withdrew, but the alliance Arminius had assembled would soon collapse as the other Germanic lords became wary of his growing power and assassinated him in 21 AD. A triumph and triumphal arch were granted for Germanicus at Rome following his initial campaign into Germania. But these honors had another message behind them, that Tiberius considered the conflict at an end and that Germanicus should now return to Rome. Germanicus didn't heed the message and began the campaign anew in 16 AD. Tiberius couldn't risk the political disaster of Germanicus's refusal if he ordered him back to Rome, and so, for the moment, Germanicus got his way, despite Tiberius's disapproval. Germanicus won successive victories in the months that followed, bolstering his popularity amongst the legions and the people of Rome even further. He was a shrewd manipulator of public opinion. For instance, after disaster struck his fleet during the German campaign on his way to winter quarters along the coast of the North Atlantic, Germanicus struck out quickly to prevent the loss of Roman morale by recovering one of the standards of the Roman legions, which had been lost at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. The recovery of the standard made no practical difference to the strategic situation in Germania, but from a propaganda standpoint, it was a major achievement. Tiberius was aware of his potential heir's growing popularity as a result of these measures, and late in 16 AD he made it clear that his own biological son, Drusus the Younger, would soon be joining Germanicus in the north to share the glory with him in Germania. Germanicus's growing popularity in the north was not the only thing which taxed Tiberius during these first years of his reign. A conspiracy against the imperial family had also allegedly been unearthed at Rome during the same period. This involved Scribonius Libo Drusus. Scribonius had served as praetor in 15 AD, even as Tiberius was having his actions monitored. Soon information was passed to the government that Scribonius had consulted with astrologers and fortune-tellers concerning Tiberius and the royal family, while writings in his own hand contained the names of members of the imperial family and senators, with strange symbols beside them. These peculiar documents and Scribonius's consultations with astrologers and other practitioners of magic was deemed sufficient to have him placed on trial in 16 AD on charges of conspiring against the emperor and the imperial family. Scribonius subsequently appealed to Tiberius directly, but when the emperor dismissed his implorations, Scribonius committed suicide. Following this, Tiberius pronounced that Scribonius was guilty. His property was divided as a reward between his prosecutors. The name Drusus was forbidden to be used by any member of the Scribonia family, and it is likely that Scribonius's body was displayed on the Gemonian stairs near the Roman Forum. Further decrees banished fortune-tellers and astrologers from the country. But the trouble was not over. New unrest would focus on a freed man named Clemens, a former slave of Agrippa Postumus who had arrived too late to save his master back in 14 AD, when he was executed on Augustus's orders. This Clemens had laid low in the intervening period and allowed his hair and beard to grow to enhance his resemblance to Agrippa Postumus. He then began spreading rumors that he was in fact Agrippa Postumus and was still alive. The rumors took hold, coupled with occasional fleeting glimpses of Clemens purporting to be the deceased grandson of Augustus, until they were believed throughout Italy and in Rome itself. When Clemens finally journeyed to Ostia, the main port of Rome, he was welcomed there by a large crowd. Tiberius, not wanting to make his own position seem weak by sending troops to intercept him, instead dispatched some of the Praetorian Guard to capture Clemens. He was subsequently transferred in secret to Rome. There, despite being questioned extensively, he refused to name his co-conspirators. Accordingly, he was executed quietly and the whole matter was hushed up. But the episode of both Scribonius and Clemens highlighted the weaknesses of the regime and heightened Tiberius's own paranoia that his position might fall foul of one conspiracy or another. In 17 AD, Tiberius's biological son, Drusus the Younger, took his place in the army in Illyricum, while Germanicus was appointed to take command in the east. But he wasn't to go alone. Germanicus traveled east with Calpurnius Piso, a senior Roman politician whom Tiberius had served alongside as consul way back in 7 BC. This Piso was now appointed by Tiberius with the approval of the Senate as legate of the province of Syria. It is likely that Piso was to act as Tiberius's eyes and ears in the east, and to ensure that Germanicus did not become too independent there or win the kind of great favor with the Syrian troops which he had done on the Rhine. This arrangement is indicative of the level of distrust Tiberius felt towards his adopted son by this time. Clearly, Germanicus's position in the succession was only being kept in place because of Tiberius's continuing deference to Augustus's earlier wishes, and also because Germanicus had simply become too powerful. It could prove dangerous for Tiberius to try to demote him now. Whatever the motives for this arrangement in the east were, Piso and Germanicus were unfavorably disposed to one another from the beginning. Piso arrived in Syria first and set about ingratiating himself with the soldiers, earning the nickname Father of the Legions. Germanicus was aware of Piso's acts but had other matters in the east to attend to first and acquitted himself well in his duties. But from the time Piso and Germanicus met again in Cyrrhus in Syria, they were openly hostile to one another. Germanicus journeyed to Egypt in 19 AD and, by doing so, made a political blunder. He was open-handed in his dealings and well received by the people of the capital there, Alexandria. But by entering Egypt, he had gone against one of the decrees of Augustus, who had stipulated that any member of the Senate must have authorization to enter the country. Mark Antony had carved out his power base here decades earlier, and the country was the breadbasket of Rome. Augustus had wished to avoid the country being politicized thereafter. Now Tiberius wrote to Germanicus, chastising his affability with the people and adoption of Greek dress since his arrival in the East, and further complaining of his defiance in entering Egypt without imperial authorization. Tiberius held Augustus's precepts in reverence and strove to uphold them, and this action on Germanicus's part must have seemed an affront to these ideals. Germanicus had assumed that Egypt was just another province that he was to deal with in his command of the East, for which his commission provided the necessary authorization. Relations between Piso and Germanicus didn't improve in the younger man's absence in Egypt, and a short time after his return to Syria, Germanicus fell ill. He would recover for a short period before relapsing, and he became convinced that Piso was poisoning him. Germanicus died on the 10th of October 19 AD from an unknown illness. With his death, Germanicus's supporters replaced Piso as governor of Syria with one of their own, and a short conflict ensued. Eventually, Piso surrendered and he was granted safe conduct to Rome. When news first came to Rome of Germanicus's illness, rumors abounded in the capital that the popular young heir had been poisoned by the emperor. Rumors of this kind regularly surfaced in Rome during the early imperial period, and indeed, when Lucius and Gaius, the sons of Julia and Marcus Agrippa, had perished at young ages within 2 years of each other in 2 AD and 4 AD, many had speculated that Tiberius's mother Livia had been responsible and was seeking to ensure the succession of Tiberius as emperor by having Augustus's blood heirs murdered. Now Tiberius faced charges of having done the same to Germanicus to secure his own position and pave the way for his biological son, Drusus the Younger, to succeed him. When Germanicus's wife Agrippina returned to Rome with his ashes, public feeling grew against Tiberius, who had not shown any grief for him. nor had any senior member of the imperial family been part of Agrippina's escort into the city. Tiberius's distrust of Agrippina deepened as public sympathy for her grew. In the midst of this crisis surrounding Germanicus's death, a thorny issue arose. Calpurnius Piso was faced with serious charges of misconduct when he returned from the East. The Senate initially tried to pass his trial to Tiberius, but the emperor refused and referred it back to the Senate, knowing that if Piso was cleared, it would be taken as proof of Tiberius's rumored complicity in Germanicus's murder. Tiberius opened the case with a well-reasoned speech, arguing that only facts should be taken into consideration and that they should not be influenced in their decisions by his personal connection to Germanicus. From the outset of the trial, the mood within the Senate, and indeed in Rome at large, was hostile towards Piso. The politician, seeing this and realizing that Tiberius was unlikely to intervene to save him, committed suicide before a decision was reached. But Tiberius did intervene, at his mother Livia's request, on behalf of Piso's wife when she was also placed on trial. This was an act of mercy, but it only served to reinforce the belief amongst the people of Rome that Tiberius and his mother had been in some way involved in Germanicus's death. The period of endless crises at the start of Tiberius's reign and his dwindling popularity at Rome took its toll on Tiberius. In 21 AD, citing ill health, he left the capital for Campania, the region to the south of Rome towards towns like Pompeii and Neapolis, overlooking the Bay of Naples. He left his biological son and possible new heir, Drusus the Younger, in charge of the city. To cement his son's position, he made him consul and wrote to the Senate asking that Drusus be granted the tribunician powers which Tiberius had held for so many years during Augustus's reign. Although still emperor, Tiberius yearned for a peaceful retirement and distance from public affairs. Accordingly, when the Senate called upon him to decide on the appointment of a governor of the province of Africa in what is now Tunisia, he criticized them in his response, asserting that it was their responsibility to decide on this matter and ordering them to choose between the two candidates. In a worrying portent of things to come, the Senate chose Blasus, an uncle of Sejanus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, as the governor. It was a sign of the growing influence of the imperial bodyguard, and of Sejanus in particular within Roman politics. This first period of exile from Rome for Tiberius only came to an end in 22 AD when he reluctantly returned to the capital after learning that his mother, Livia, was ill. Tiberius suffered a blow in 23 AD when, on the 14th of September, his son and potential successor Drusus the Younger died. At the time, no one believed it was any more than a natural death. Drusus had been ill in 21 AD but recovered. However, some years later, accusations arose that Drusus had in fact been poisoned by Sejanus. It is impossible to verify this claim with any certainty, despite the role Sejanus was to play going forward. Following Drusus's death, Tiberius spoke first impassively in the Senate, not displaying his grief and rebuking others for their own expressions of mourning. When his speech turned to the succession, he commended the sons of Germanicus, Nero Caesar and Drusus Caesar, to the care of the Senate and asked that the burdens of government be increasingly shouldered by them once they came of age to do so. Whatever the truth of Drusus the Younger's death might have been, we know for certain that Sejanus quickly began cementing his position in the aftermath of the death of the emperor's son. He wasted little time in trying to undermine Germanicus's widow Agrippina, who, as mother to Nero Caesar and Drusus Caesar, the two sons of Germanicus, whom Tiberius had indicated were now his heirs, could play a significant role in Rome's politics going forward. Throughout 24 AD and 25 AD, Sejanus engineered accusations against many of Agrippina's influential supporters and had them placed on trial. Tiberius intervened on behalf of some of the condemned, but for others insisted on the penalty of exile, and it is through these trials that we see a hardening of Tiberius's attitude towards what others said or wrote about him. Whereas earlier in his rule he was prepared to brush insults off, now he regarded them as breaches of the law of Maiestas, which claimed that his position as princeps was inviolable. He had also decided to continue his exile from Rome, and from the period of the death of Drusus the Younger, he largely resided at a pleasure palace he had built for himself on the island of Capri in the Bay of Naples. Rumors abounded about Tiberius engaging in sadistic and sexually depraved acts here during his exile. Much of this was probably spurious rumor related by later Roman historians such as the imperial biographer Suetonius, but it is indicative of how poor Tiberius's reputation was by the middle years of his reign that such a view of him had developed. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Sejanus conspired and became the real power in the city. In 25 AD, he wrote to Tiberius to offer himself as a potential husband for Livia Julia, Drusus the Younger's widow, stating that he would be happy to act in the defense of her children against the attacks of Agrippina. Tiberius initially replied, praising Sejanus's loyalty, but tactfully refusing the offer. It has been suggested that it was at this time that Sejanus began encouraging Tiberius to spend more and more time away from Rome. But it seems to be an incident later in the year, again possibly engineered by Sejanus, that pushed Tiberius towards his decision to fully retire to Capri, when he was forced to listen to a witness in a Maestas trial recount all that the accused had supposedly said of the emperor, prompting an outburst from Tiberius and causing him to shun later meetings of the Senate. Sejanus continued to cultivate the widening rift between Tiberius and Agrippina when a cousin of hers faced her own trial in 26 AD. Agrippina abandoned caution and chided Tiberius publicly. Tiberius replied, accusing her of envy as she did not enjoy a position of power. But, despite their differences, when Agrippina fell ill a short time later, he did visit her. Agrippina took the opportunity to ask that she be married again, but Tiberius left without giving her an answer. Still, Sejanus persisted, and later that year, Agrippina appeared to believe warnings that Tiberius wanted to poison her when she attended dinner with him, but ate nothing. It was later in 26 AD that Tiberius finally made his decision to fully retire from his official duties in Rome, first journeying to Campania to dedicate temples at Capua and Nola, before settling permanently at his new palace on the island of Capri. When Tiberius set out from Rome, his retinue was made up largely of scholars, with only one senator and 2 eques, Sejanus being one of them. It was while in Campania at a villa named Spelunca that Sejanus cemented himself firmly within Tiberius's confidence when he protected the emperor from a rockfall that closed the mouth of the cave in which they were dining, remaining in place until they were rescued. With Tiberius away from Rome, the business of ruling became more protracted as the Senate still declined the responsibility that Tiberius had tried to instill in them, and so all matters had to be conducted through letters, causing inevitable delays. But when disaster struck first at Fidenae, when a poorly built amphitheater collapsed, and then a fire raged across the Celian hill, Tiberius did compensate all involved depending on their losses. Welfare towards his subjects remained a paramount concern of his, despite how little praise he might have received for it. Capitalizing on his act in protecting Tiberius, Sejanus had wasted no time in furthering his plot against Agrippina and began targeting her and Germanicus's eldest son, Nero Caesar, reporting exaggerated remarks he had made to Tiberius and playing on the jealousy of his younger brother Drusus Caesar. Then, when Tiberius was safely installed on Capri in 27 AD, he had a record kept of both Agrippina's and Nero's movements, as well as anything they said that could be construed as being aimed against Tiberius. Sejanus moved against another of Agrippina's supporters, Sabinus, at the same time, devising a plot in which Sabinus was set up to incriminate himself in a conversation in front of hidden witnesses, who duly reported his words to Tiberius in a letter. Tiberius wrote to the Senate in January 28 AD attacking Sabinus. It has been suggested that some of his claims were products of his imagination rather than anything reported to him by Sejanus, as the emperor grew ever more suspicious of plots against him. Nevertheless, his letter swayed the Senate, and they passed a death sentence on Sabinus. Tiberius wrote in thanks for their punishment of an enemy of the state, and that he feared for his life from the plots of his enemies. In 29 AD, the matriarch of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Tiberius's mother and Augustus's widow Livia, died. Surprisingly, Tiberius did not return to Rome for her funeral. Instead, he wrote to the Senate, attacking Agrippina and Nero Caesar on various grounds. The people of Rome protested, saying that these latest accusations were once again the work of Sejanus. For his part, Sejanus embellished the information given to Tiberius, claiming it wouldn't be long before the people rose up and made Nero Caesar the new emperor, with Agrippina acting as the real power behind the throne. Tiberius wrote to the Senate again, and in his letter proclaimed that he would make the decision in this case, which left the Senate in no better position than they had been in after the receipt of the first letter. The exact sequence of events between 29 and 31 AD is patchy given the fragmentary nature of the sources over these years. It was during this time that Nero Caesar was declared a public enemy by the Senate, and both he and Agrippina were imprisoned on separate islands. Agrippina was treated badly by her guards and lost an eye during a beating, and when she later attempted to starve herself to death, she was force-fed to keep her alive. Tiberius also engaged in vengeful behavior towards others during this period, having the senator Gallus, who had married his ex-wife Hispania years earlier, arrested in 30 AD. He died in confinement from starvation in 33 AD. Sejanus moved also against Drusus Caesar, Agrippina's second eldest son, in 30 AD, and though he was in Tiberius's company at the time, the emperor sent him back to Rome, where he was declared a public enemy and imprisoned in the city. Then Sejanus was betrothed to Livia Julia later that year and was publicly acknowledged by Tiberius. His designation for the consulship alongside Tiberius in 31 AD was confirmed, but by the end of that year, Sejanus's power and influence was at an end. There are differing historical accounts for Tiberius's reasons for turning on Sejanus, and it has been suggested that the emperor likely came to see him for what he really was at some time in 30 AD or 31 AD, as more members of the imperial family were arrested on trumped-up charges. Throughout 31 AD, Tiberius kept Sejanus in a state of worried confusion over his position, both praising and criticizing him. A rumor even circulated that Sejanus would receive tribunician power in the near future, but ultimately it was not to be. On the morning of the 18th of October 31 AD, a letter was received by the Roman Senate from Tiberius at Capri, in which the emperor effectively ordered the execution of the head of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus was imprisoned and his execution was carried out later that day. His body was displayed on the Gemonian steps, where it was mutilated by a mob, and 3 days later the remains were cast into the Tiber. By the end of the year, the rest of his family, including his 3 children and Livia Julia, would be dead, although whether this was ordered by Tiberius is uncertain. Following Sejanus's fall, and throughout the last years of Tiberius's rule, there was an increase in trials, including those on charge of maestas. Some were instigated by Tiberius against people he perceived to be former followers of Sejanus, and therefore ongoing threats to his safety. Some cases were dismissed by Tiberius on the grounds that they were trivial in nature, as he had done years before, but others were postponed until he could investigate them, and many resulted in suicide, exile, or the death penalty. Even those who could claim old friendships with Tiberius were not immune. It was also in 33 AD, amidst these trials, that Drusus Caesar, Agrippina's second eldest son, was starved to death. Agrippina herself, who had been held prisoner for several years by this time, died later the same year. With Nero Caesar dead since 31 AD, this left only Gaius among Agrippina and Germanicus's living sons. Tiberius wrote separate letters to the Senate decrying both Drusus and Agrippina, going so far as to reveal the record that had been kept on Drusus until his death, in the hope that the Senate would come to the same understanding that he had, namely that Drusus was an enemy of the state. Despite the insecurity he obviously felt and outright cruelty in some of his actions, Tiberius was still capable of reason in some spheres. He secured marriages for Germanicus's and Agrippina's 3 daughters on a visit to the mainland, and made money available from the treasury for loans to ease the financial pressure in 33 AD, created by enforcement of the usury laws. Again, 3 years later, in 36 AD, he would make money available through a commission to those affected by a fire on the Aventine Hill in Rome. When trouble broke out in the east in 35 AD, despite not winning a resounding military victory, the matter was settled in Rome's favor when Tiberius instructed his commander in the area to make peace with Artabanus, the Arsacid prince. But ultimately, when historians such as Suetonius would come to record Tiberius's reign in subsequent decades, it was the political excesses of his later years and the free hand which he gave to Sejanus while he lived in exile on Capri which would be remembered. In 37 AD, Tiberius fell ill and later died on the 16th of March at the age of 77. Much has been made of his death, and it has been speculated that there was some foul play. But there is no conclusive evidence of this, and it is likely that later accounts that he collapsed when he got out of bed after his servants failed to attend him is closer to the truth. He was succeeded by Germanicus and Agrippina's only surviving son, Gaius Caesar, better known by the nickname he acquired in his youth, Caligula. The much anticipated succession of a member of Germanicus's line proved disastrous. The reign of this biological great-grandson of Augustus quickly descended into tyranny, sadism, and sexual depravity on the part of the third emperor of Rome. He was quickly overthrown by the Praetorian Guard and killed in 41 AD. History has often condemned Tiberius, but by the time he succeeded Augustus, he was already old by Roman standards and had served Rome and the first princeps faithfully for many years. He was a sound military leader and tactician, winning a number of victories during his career, and was firm in his traditional and republican values. Despite his military valor, he wouldn't lead the legions again after becoming emperor. His rule was fairly peaceful and focused on consolidation of existing borders, as Augustus had advised, rather than on costly new conquests. Likely somewhat reluctant to bear the burden of rule, he was devoted to the precepts of Augustus and strove to uphold them even when they conflicted with his own beliefs. It was to that end that he attempted to restore some semblance of the old Republican Senate. But far from empowering the Senate, the methods he used to try to bring them to their own decisions often caused confusion and were ultimately hollow. Following his retirement, he rarely strayed from his palace at Capri, making the Senate's job that much harder. But Tiberius's early years can be seen as fair and just. He quashed many trials and paid little attention to the words of others that in later years would be enough to condemn them, and was also generous when public welfare was at stake. There is also little credibility to the suggestion that he had Germanicus killed. With the death of his son Drusus the Younger, there was a marked change in Tiberius. Though he was still able to exercise clear judgment on some matters, his increased suspicions of those around him, no doubt fueled by the whispers of Sejanus, became a blight on his rule. Though he wasn't concerned with his popularity amongst the people, he never held their favor. Instead, their affection for Germanicus and his line only increased his paranoia and suspicious nature, driving him further into isolation and also further under the influence of Sejanus. However, we must be wary of accepting the accounts of Roman historians such as Suetonius too blindly when assessing rulers like Tiberius. Suetonius depicted Tiberius as a tyrant of sorts, but his work was biased by a desire to prove that the imperial crown would become tyrannous when it descended through a hereditary family line, rather than by one emperor choosing a qualified successor, such as was the case during Suetonius's own time of writing. Upon Sejanus's fall, there was seemingly no return to reason, and many fell victim to the trials and cruelty that followed, as Tiberius increasingly saw himself surrounded by enemies, whether real or imagined. Though he cannot be called a tyrant, his actions in later years were far removed from the man he had been, and it is ultimately this, rather than his earlier actions, that he is remembered for. What do you think of Emperor Tiberius Caesar Augustus? Was he a competent and fair, albeit reluctant ruler, who would have been remembered for his virtues and generous deeds had he not been targeted by an ambitious agitator? Or was he indeed a cruel and tyrannical ruler, as some Roman historians claim, whose true nature was only exposed in his later years? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.